Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I'll deal with the elephant in the room. The regional hubs that we identified in our recent Innovate paper was unfortunately not the Swansea and Cardiff axis in the UK. It was Leeds and Manchester and Edinburgh, Glasgow. So sorry about that, Ian. That doesn't mean there's nothing happening in Cardiff and Swansea, but they were just not the two that we called out. Right, I'm talking today about RegTech. We came here, or my boss actually came here about a year ago to talk about our call for input on RegTech and specifically the feedback that we'd got from the ecosystem about the sort of role that we should play as a regulator in the UK. And they broadly fell into these kind of four categories. I'm going to take you through these, tell you what we've been up to, give you a bit of a sense of what we've got coming up, and then I'm going to invite some panelists up to discuss this in a bit more detail. So the first thing we were asked to do was to establish ourselves in this market. So this was a new ecosystem for us with a number of participants that we were unfamiliar with, a series of interactions and participants that we didn't deal with on a regular basis. And so our initial priority, if you like, was to establish ourselves. And we've done a lot of learning over the last year. We're still learning. But some of the things that we're starting to become more involved in are a bit more tangible, so not just engagement type activities. So we're involved now in a series of consortiums or consortia for as research projects, proof of concepts and pilots. They range from looking at things like how distributed ledger technology could enable more secure transfer of mortgage transactions data, so sort of on the reg reporting side of things, through to the need for and the role for us to play in working with the industry on common data models and common domain models to help simplify reg reporting obligations for firms, all the way through to other initiatives such as one that we're involved in looking at effectively an intra-bank knowledge exchange platform, which, if I can unpack that a bit, effectively like a Wikipedia for banks to use to exchange views on regulatory requirements, to crowdsource views, guidance and information about how to comply with those regulations and to work together in an open collaborative platform to share their insights and their ideas. We're also involved in a couple of new RegTech councils and fora that are springing up around the world. There's two kind of primary ones that get a lot of attention at the moment. The RegTech Council, which is based in the UK, and then the International RegTech Association. So we work with all these different bodies. We're starting to get involved in these pilots, these tests, these projects. And we're also involved in a piece of EU-funded research, which is effectively looking at the role that smart contracts may play in automating regulatory compliance in the future. So we're involved in the consortia with various academic bodies, financial institutions, and other regulators. That one is quite publicly available. And in fact, all of these projects are things that we list on our RegTech website at the FCA. We've also had to do quite a lot to up the understanding generally in the FCA about RegTech, so to build the FCA's intellectual capital and understanding of the RegTech market. So we ran a whole series of bits and pieces internally to share what we're finding and what my team's seeing in the RegTech market. We've probably met 300 to 400 RegTech firms, academics, consultancies and others over the last year, so not a small number. And we get a reasonable insight in what's going on, but we need to share that with our colleagues internally so that when they go out to regulated firms, they recognise these technologies, they know what's happening in the market and how these technologies can shape and change things for the future. Those of you that have been to a number of FinTech and RegTech events are probably sick of the sight of me. I do quite a lot of these discussions and speeches. That is quite an important part of our becoming credible and becoming relevant in this ecosystem. We need to be visible, we need to be out there, we need to be meeting firms and understanding what's going on. And we do things like podcasts and bits and pieces like that, again, to just broaden people's understanding of what we're doing and the role we intend to play. So I think we've done a reasonable job at establishing ourselves, but that's kind of the first stage in the journey of things and the roles that the ecosystem would like us to play. The second role that was highlighted for us was to be a convener and a catalyst for RegTech development in the UK. And this presents some interesting and some fascinating work for us actually, and led to things like our first hackathon events, which in an organisation that has such a focus on cyber and resilience, we weren't allowed to call them hackathons. So they are branded as tech sprints, the same kind of idea. We've done 3 of these so far over the past 15 months. I think, as was mentioned on the first panel, as far as we're aware, we're the first regulator to attempt these kind of events, which brings with it both exciting challenges but also a fair degree of risk. So we have tried to learn as we've done each of the 3 events so far, and we continue to tweak the way in which we run these hackathons. We've done 3 so far, as I mentioned. The first was looking at issues around access to financial services and the way in which different RegTech solutions could support consumers, particularly those who can't identify themselves to the financial system, or perhaps have a very weak or thin credit history. So looking at different biometric authentication options, different alternative credit solutions, and how they can help firms provide access to the 1.5 million people in the UK who don't currently have even a basic banking account. The second event was focused on one of the big challenges that the industry tells us it faces when it comes to regulatory compliance, and that was around understanding, interpreting, and then implementing and meeting regulatory reporting requirements. So the industry at large provides a significant amount of data to ourselves and other regulators, but interprets those regulatory requirements through huge expenditure on consultancies, compliance support, etc., interprets that generally independently of one another, so each firm spending significant sums on doing that, and then tries to comply with those regulatory requirements independently. So we were looking at how could different technologies unlock reg reporting, aiding interpretation of the requirements, and then facilitating more efficient production and sharing of data with regulators. So that was the second hackathon back in November. And then the third one, more recently, was in March. And you'll see a bit of a theme. We either focus on big industry problems where we think there's lots of cost efficiencies to be realised, or we focus on areas where we feel the market isn't working well for consumers. So access was the first one, and the second one we focused on was on money and mental health and the connections between people with poor mental health and poor financial health, and how technology could help both consumers to understand their financial behaviour, so probably more on the fintech side, but then on the RegTech side, how technology could help firms to understand, predict, identify consumers who are experiencing mental health episodes and respond and treat them fairly with that information to hand. So we're looking at a whole series of technologies there, ranging from wearable tech to identify mental health issues through to information sharing and API-based mechanisms to help people understand their spending habits and what they're up to. So these tech sprints are a great way for us to convene groups. They're a good way for us to shine light on industry problems. They're a really useful way for us to learn the role that different technologies and different approaches can play in meeting regulatory requirements. And they're just a good way of us starting to build partnerships and relationships between different members in the RegTech ecosystem. As part of the tech sprints, we tend to do what we call a tech talk as well. This is much more like this. We'll have panels, we'll have discussions. The idea of those really is to raise the RegTech discussion up to the C-suite within institutions, so that it's not just a technology discussion, but also a discussion about the business problems, the consumer needs, the potential business cases for RegTech solutions, such that we get more buy-in in institutions for taking the work out of the hackathons forward. So we've done a series of these tech talks, and we'll continue to do those as well. We don't have our own accelerator. We have engaged a lot with some of the big accelerators in the UK and beyond over the course of this year. Our involvement tends to be in helping the accelerators come up with interesting use cases, problem statements, and areas where we think they should direct technology providers towards solving. So we try and help articulate the use cases and the problems. It's a little bit complicated if we get involved in kind of final decision making about who gets funding in things like accelerators, so we're tending not to go into that area at the moment, albeit some of our regulatory peers elsewhere in the world do that more actively. And I think the final one here, as I say, we meet a lot of entities in this market. We've actually been fairly successful in creating some new partnerships, creating some new commercial partnerships, or at least creating the connection that's led to those partnerships. A lot of that happens through the tech sprints, but it just also happens through our day-to-day meetings and discussions with entities. So I think we're doing a reasonable job in fostering and developing but we're still learning, particularly around how we use these different engagement mechanisms, how we use tech sprints versus tech talks, and just how far we can go in this kind of connection building between entities. The third thing we were asked to look at is trickier for us. So we were asked to consider certifying or approving certain RegTech solutions as meeting regulatory requirements. This poses quite a few challenges to us. One of the primary issues is a lot of the RegTech solutions are not themselves allowing the facilitation of a regulated activity. So we tend to approve firms and individuals to perform regulated activities. So technology on their own, there might be some exceptions to this, the technology on its own in the RegTech space tends not to be performing a regulated activity. So us giving approval for it is quite a complicated thing to do. Secondly, us approving or certifying certain technologies risks us distorting the market. And we, as a regulator, have a competition mandate generally, and we are quite conscious of the potential impact we could have on disrupting the competitive pressures in the market if we start to certify certain RegTech solutions over others. So at the moment, this is not a space that we are particularly looking to take forward. But as I will say throughout this discussion, we are keen to kind of continue to hear feedback on just how important that aspect of the call for input findings is to RegTech providers. So what can we do? We are working with a number of standards bodies, looking at where we can help articulate clear standards for institutions to consider when looking to adopt RegTech solutions. We are continuing to work with a number of global bodies on some of the key data standards that will unlock some of the RegTech solutions and make them perhaps more efficient and expand the use cases for them. And we are working with some of the industry groups who are looking at trying to come up with industry frameworks for how to assess and manage IT risk and how to consider and manage the risks of deploying RegTech solutions onto their infrastructure. So we're involved in these groups, but at the moment we're not going as far as kind of certifying specific technologies as meeting regulatory requirements. When we first started looking at RegTech, I think we put out a definition that basically said it was a subset of fintech and it was focused on helping firms meet regulatory requirements or understand regulatory requirements and meet them. I think this is often the risk of being a bit of a first mover in some of these things. I think that definition is looking a bit narrow nowadays. So I think we've kind of seen RegTech morph into two distinct camps. There's the RegTech that helps firms understand and comply with regulation, and then there's the RegTech for use by ourselves in supervising and monitoring financial markets more efficiently. In some jurisdictions, this has now been labelled SupTech or supervision tech. We've tended not to add another phrase to the dictionary, so we consider this RegTech as well. But a lot of our activity over the last year has been looking at RegTech's application for ourselves as well, and encouraging and bringing other international regulators to the table. I think the previous panel has talked about various efforts around the world and various initiatives around the world. I think we've taken a very active role in trying to expand the RegTech discussion globally. We equally, though, we've sought to learn quite a bit from what has happened elsewhere. So we have looked with a lot of interest at things like India Stack and the Aadhaar platform as a KYC and a biometric identification platform and the role that that's playing in unlocking access to financial services in India. We look with interest at things like MAS's API playbook. And again, we welcome feedback from market participants on where you're seeing things in other jurisdictions that would be useful and should be pursued in the UK. But we are continuing to also look at the extent to which we can do cross-border pilots, tests, potentially hackathons with other regulators in overseas jurisdictions, particularly where there are common use cases that cross borders. And things like AML, KYC compliance are one of the topics that seems to fall quite squarely into that international agenda. We're also exploring, and this is I suppose a bit of a bold leap for us, and we're not seeing anyone else do this yet, so we're trying to learn and work out how to do this. We're looking at the extent to which we can make parts of our handbook initially machine readable and then fully machine executable, which for the non-techies in the room may be a bit intense, but effectively converting probably initially our regulatory reporting rules into truly unambiguous triples that machines can interpret and implement directly. The idea being that we can put out rules that are not just written in plain language or or in some cases legalese, but are written in ways that can be fully and unambiguously interpreted by machines, such that firms can comply with those regulations and those requirements much more efficiently and strip enormous cost out in terms of trying to interpret and understand what a regulatory requirement means in practice. So there's a whole series of steps involved in making this happen, but this is an area that we're looking at quite intently at the moment. The other thing we're involved in is trying to broaden, as I say, we're trying to broaden the RegTech discussion globally, and there is a RegTech for Regulators Accelerator program funded by the Gates Foundation and the Omidyar Network, which I'm an advisor to, and this is looking at how to help emerging market regulators effectively use digital financial supervision tools and techniques more efficiently. So to leapfrog some of the legacy and manual processes that many established regulators may have, and to be able to supervise particularly fintech and digital financial services firms more efficiently so that they can encourage the adoption of those fintech offerings in their markets and effectively grow access and grow financial wealth and poverty alleviation. So this is has a fairly strong kind of social dimension to it and a societal value dimension to it. But we're involved as an advisor to that program, trying to help them understand the types of technologies that we think regulators in emerging markets may want to consider and indeed may want to avoid because we have perhaps invested money in them in the past. And then the final sort of area here for us is really looking at how we use some of these technologies internally. So we have a huge amount of programs and projects and initiatives looking at this at the moment, and they range from better use of things like speech and text analytics tools within the FCA through to how we make better use of social media analytics and media analytics, through to how we use things like natural language processing tools to automate some of our manual processes, and then into things like how we use supervised machine learning for predictive analytics and how we use unsupervised AI for detecting misleading financial promotions. So a whole series of things where we're looking at some of the underlying technologies and approaches and techniques that sit behind a lot of the RegTech solutions to try and see how we can deploy them internally to be more efficient and to better identify risks and issues in financial markets. So aside from deployment internally, these are probably the main areas that we focus on when it comes to RegTech at the moment. We have a really strong preference for open collaboration, so it's much easier for us to engage with consortia and groups and research projects and pilots where there's a relatively open collaborative approach being adopted. It's much more difficult for us to engage directly, bilaterally with individual firms on tests and processes, unless that's through something like the Reg Sandbox. But where we're engaging more broadly, it allows us much more latitude to be involved, and we tend to look for areas where there is minimal competitive advantage currently being realised by the industry, and yet fairly significant costs being incurred. So, as I said, reg reporting is one of those areas. AML and KYC compliance is another one of those areas. Obviously, the risk decisions that firms make on the back of that KYC information is an area where they may derive some competitive advantage. But undertaking KYC, porting KYC information, undertaking background checks and sanctions checks, there's not a whole lot of competitive advantage to be realised there. So that's an area that we are very interested in. It does build on the first tech sprint where we looked at access and the role that digital ID and biometrics may play in identifying consumers. It is an area with some significant challenges, though, to be overcome. So it's an area that we will engage very extensively with the industry on and welcome viewpoints on. There are a whole series of questions around data privacy, around trust, around data residency, around things like master data integrity and entity data integrity that will need to be overcome in order to have kind of truly industry-wide solutions to some of these challenges. But it's an area that we're very, very interested in. And as I mentioned already, we will continue to look at where technology can derive better consumer outcomes, so whether that be in the consumer access or in the consumer protection space. That is where probably our RegTech and our FinTech work somewhat overlaps. I thought this might give a bit of sense of how the market for RegTech is growing generally. I've got two slides. I think there's a third that's gone in erroneously, but it's just a copy of this one. For those that can't see this, this is Twitter impressions of RegTech and FCA. So they're the two search terms we look for, and it shows that around some of our very high-profile events, the discussion in social media increases enormously to the extent that our last one had over 5 million tweets, 5 million impressions on a single day. So I think what this is showing us is there are ways in which we can use some of these convening events to grow the awareness of RegTech and to grow the discussion globally of RegTech. And that, as I say, this is just RegTech and the FCA tagged in tweets together. So it shows kind of where we're playing a part. The next one is just the number of tweets about RegTech globally over the past couple of years, which has tailed off very slightly, but I won't read too much into that. But has grown nearly exponentially over some of this period to a point where there's up to about 30,000 tweets a month about RegTech at the moment. And when you think back a little more than a year and a half ago, there was less than 1,000 a month. In fact, about 2 years ago, there was none. So I think this is just showing how global this issue is becoming. The USA, the UK, France, Canada, and India dominate the Twitter coverage on RegTech. Clearly, this is one metric, I understand that, but I think it gives you a sense of how RegTech has grown fairly significantly, particularly over the last year, and hopefully we've played some part in making that happen thus far. As I say, this is the copy of the one before. I'm going to stop. I have got some panellists joining me. I think I've probably got time for a few questions. I can see my panellists eagerly waiting at the back. I will take a couple of questions directly, and then I'll open and invite the panel up.
Hi, James Belmont, Beringer Partners. You talked a lot about RegTech in the context of what I see mostly as conduct and KYC and AML and those sorts of things, which I guess is central to the FCA's mandate. Would you care to comment at all on prudential RegTech and whether there's any collaboration between the FCA and the PRA and thinking on that?
So I won't comment specifically on prudential RegTech solutions, but there is a lot of collaboration between us and the PRA, particularly on things like on the reg reporting piece. So you may view that as not specifically a prudential matter, but the way in which we collect prudential information from firms is something that we both do jointly in an area where we can realise some good efficiencies for ourselves and the firms. I think a lot of we work closely with them on their accelerator program as well. So they have an accelerator to test fintech and RegTech solutions for their own adoption. So we work with them on that and make sure that we're not kind of mirroring or overlapping too much of our work with them on that. They're involved in each of our tech sprints. And I think generally there's pretty regular and open dialogue, but we don't specifically talk about an individual theme like prudential RegTech solutions. But we have on a number of occasions recommended and connected the PRA to entities and technology providers that we think would be of interest and relevance to them.